My twin came to me hurt and shaken, saying his wife's family had cornered him with $50,000 in debt and threats of pay now or worse. We secretly swapped the next day. I captured every threat for a week and made one call that changed everything. Tuesday night at 11:30, 4 p.m. My doorbell went off out of nowhere, and it immediately felt wrong because I wasn't expecting a soul, hadn't ordered takeout, and wasn't waiting on any deliveries. So when I opened the door and saw my twin brother Mike standing there, I knew something was bad, because I know that face better than my own, and this version of it was wrecked, blood running down his cheek, his left eye swollen completely shut, his lip busted open, his shirt ripped at the collar, and one arm wrapped tight around his ribs like he was afraid they'd give out. And when he asked if he could come in, his voice barely holding together, I stepped aside without saying a word and watched him limp to the couch, every step clearly costing him more pain than the last. And once he collapsed there, I asked who did this to him. And he told me it was Emily's brother, Kyle. And when I asked why, thinking maybe money or drugs or something stupid, he said it was about money, $50,000 to be exact. So I sat down across from him and told him to start from the beginning. And he took a shallow breath, winced hard, and began explaining how 3 years ago at the wedding, Emily's family, who'd made their money through a construction business that had been running for 3 generations, offered to help with the down payment on the house, calling it a gift and saying it was their way of welcoming him into the family. And the same thing happened with the car and with the wedding venue when it went way over budget. And when I said those sounded like gifts, he said that's exactly what he thought too, right up until 2 months ago. And when I asked what changed then, he told me Kyle's business went under, filed for bankruptcy, lost everything, and suddenly every so-called gift turned into a loan, complete with paperwork. And when I asked if there was really paperwork, he nodded and said there were signed loan agreements with his signature on every page. And when I asked if he actually signed them, he said he didn't remember signing a single thing, but the signatures looked exactly like his, professional enough to fool even him. And it took a second for that to sink in, that someone had forged documents well enough to pass as real. And when I asked how much they were claiming total, he said $47,000 for the wedding costs, the house down payment, the car loan, plus interest, then let out this bitter laugh and said they'd conveniently rounded it up to $50,000. And when I asked what happened tonight, he told me Kyle showed up at the house with his Uncle Ron and said they were done waiting and that Mike had until the end of the month to pay up, 3 weeks. And when I asked what would happen if he didn't, Mike lifted his shirt to show deep purple bruises stretched across his ribs, fresh and angry, and said this was just a preview. And I stared at those bruises trying to do the math in my head and asked if he'd called the police. And he said call them and say what? That they didn't break in and he let them inside. And when I asked where Emily was during all this, he said she was there the whole time, standing in the corner crying and not saying a word. And when I asked if she tried to stop them, he didn't answer, which told me everything I needed to know. So I asked where she was now, and he said she was still at the house with her family, and they told him to go find the money from whoever would give it to him. And that's why he came to me, because I was the only one he trusted. So I got up, poured 2 glasses of water, handed him one, and watched him struggle just to lift it to his split lip. And I told him we needed to think this through carefully. And he said he'd been thinking about it nonstop for 2 months, and there was no way out, that he didn't have 50 grand. Couldn't afford the lawyers needed to prove the signatures were fake, and even if he could, Kyle had made it clear he didn't care about courts or the law. So I asked exactly what Kyle said, and Mike told me Kyle said courts take years, and he doesn't have years, that he needs the money now. And if he doesn't get it, he'll make sure Mike can't work, can't walk, can't finish the sentence, because he didn't have to. And I walked over to the window and looked out at the empty street thinking about my brother, about his wife who stood by while he was beaten, about men who forge papers and use violence to collect fake debts. And that's when I turned back and said the thing that changed everything, that we're identical. And when Mike looked at me confused, I spelled it out that we're identical twins, same height, same voice, same face, same everything. And when he asked what that had to do with anything, I told him Emily's family has never met me. I wasn't at the wedding because I was deployed overseas, and they don't even know I exist. And when he asked what I was saying, I told him that for the next 3 weeks I could be him, that I could go to his house, live his life, and quietly document everything. And when he asked what I meant by document, I said record every conversation, every threat, every admission, and build a case so airtight that when we take it to the FBI, Kyle and Ron wouldn't just be dealing with a civil case. They'd be facing federal prison, and Mike stared at me like I'd lost my mind and said it was insane, and I asked if it really was, because they were counting on him being scared and alone and desperate, and they weren't counting on there being two of him. And when he said they'd hurt me, I told him I'd handled worse and I'd be careful. And when he asked what would happen if Emily realized I wasn't him, I told him I'd thought about that and asked how well she really knew him anymore. And after a long silence, he admitted that lately she didn't know him well at all, that they'd been distant, sleeping in separate rooms sometimes, that she'd been secretive and glued to her phone, and he'd assumed it was stress, but maybe it wasn't. Maybe she'd been working with her family longer than he realized, and I watched his expression change as that idea settled in. And when he asked if I thought she was in on it, I said we needed to find out. So I sat back down, pulled out my phone, and started laying out the plan, telling him that tomorrow morning we swap places. He stays here completely off the grid with no calls or messages or anything that could tip them off, and I go to his house and play the scared, desperate husband scrambling for money. And when he asked what then, I told him I'd watch, listen, and record everything. That if Emily was involved, I'd know. If there were other victims, I'd find them. And if Kyle and Ron had pulled this before, there would be evidence. And when he asked how long this would go on, I said 3 weeks, the same deadline they gave him. And he looked down at his bruised knuckles like he'd try to fight back and asked what the end game was. And I told him, federal charges for extortion, fraud, assault, and conspiracy. That if we did this right, they wouldn't just lose money, they'd lose their freedom. And when he asked what happens if we mess it up, I told him we'd both end up looking like he did right now. And he almost smiled before wincing instead and asked if I'd really put myself in danger for 3 weeks for him. And I told him he's my twin. We shared a womb. And he's the only person on earth who has my face, so of course I'd do it. And after a long moment, he finally agreed. So I stood up and told him the guest room was ready and to get some sleep, because we start at 5 in the morning. And when he asked why so early, I told him because we needed time to practice, that he had to teach me how to be him down to every detail, how he takes his coffee, which side of the bed he sleeps on, how he talks to Emily, even the name of the neighbor's dog. And when he said that was a lot, I reminded him we had 12 hours, and as he slowly and painfully stood up, I told him we were going to get through this, both of us. And when he asked how I knew, I told him because they made one mistake. And when he asked what that was, I said they thought he was alone. And at 5:17 a.m. Wednesday morning, we were sitting at my kitchen table with legal pads, coffee, and his wallet, keys, watch, and wedding ring laid out between us. I asked him to describe the house, and he told me it was a 3-bedroom, 2-story place in the suburbs where they'd been living for about 2 years. And when I asked about the layout, he explained that the front door opens straight into the living room. The kitchen sits toward the back. The stairs are on the left. Their bedroom is the first door on the right upstairs, and the guest room is at the end of the hall. And when I asked where he usually spent his time, he said mostly on the living room couch or down in his basement office. So I told him to show me pictures, and he pulled out his phone, scrolling through shot after shot, showing me every room from every angle like he was giving me a virtual tour. And then I asked about Emily's daily routine, and he said she usually wakes up around 7:30, showers, makes coffee, and doesn't say much in the mornings. And when I asked where she worked, he told me she didn't anymore, that she quit her job 6 months ago, saying she needed a break, which I wrote down because it felt like one of those details that could matter later. And when I asked what she does all day now, he admitted he didn't really know, that she's always on her phone, disappears for hours, and says she's meeting friends. And when I asked which friends, he hesitated and said he honestly didn't know. So I made more notes and then asked him about Kyle, Emily's older brother, and he described him as 38, a big guy around 6'3" and maybe 240. Someone who used to do MMA before a back injury and who took over the construction business before it collapsed. And when I asked about his temper, he said it was bad but controlled, that Kyle knows how to hurt people without leaving obvious marks. And when I asked how he knew that, Mike just pointed at his ribs and said this was the second time, which made me stop writing, because the second time meant there was a first. And he explained that 3 months ago, before the loan stuff even started, Kyle came over saying Mike wasn't treating Emily right and that he needed to be taught respect. And he said it in this flat voice that told me how serious it was. And when I asked if Emily knew about that incident, he said he told her he fell down the stairs and she didn't question it, which I mentally filed away because it meant she was either completely blind or deeply involved, and neither option was good. And then I asked about Ron, Kyle's uncle, and Mike told me Ron was in his late 50s, Emily's father's brother, the smart one who handled the business side. With connections everywhere, lawyers, judges, contractors, the kind of guy people owed favors to. And when I asked if Ron was violent, he said not directly. That Ron lets Kyle do the dirty work while he stands back and makes it clear he's the one calling the shots. And when I asked who else was in the family, he said Emily's mother died years ago and her father passed last year from a heart attack, and that's when things really started changing. And when I asked how they changed, he said Emily grew distant, Kyle got more aggressive, and Ron started showing up more often. And after a pause, he said he thought the father had been the one keeping everyone in line. And once he was gone, the wolves came out. And when I looked down at my notes, I realized I'd already filled 2 pages. But I had one more question that was bothering me. So I asked why Kyle had a key to the house, and Mike blinked like the thought had never crossed his mind. And when I asked if they knocked or rang the bell the night before, he said no. Kyle just walked in, which meant he had a key. And when I said Mike never gave him one, the truth settled in between us, that Emily must have. And Mike went quiet, processing what that meant, that his wife had given her brother a key to their house without telling him. And I didn't answer when he asked why she would do that, because we both already knew. And by 6:45 a.m., we were swapping clothes, his jeans fitting me perfectly, his shirt, his watch, his wedding ring sliding onto my finger, feeling strange, like I was carrying 3 years of his marriage on my hand. And when he asked how he looked, I told him he looked like me, which he said was creepy, and I told him that was the whole point. And after checking myself in the mirror, same face and build but a different man behind the eyes, I asked about our safety protocol, and he told me if anything went wrong, he'd text me one word, pineapple, which he said was a college thing I didn't need to hear about. And I told him if I saw that word, I'd call 911 immediately, give them the address, and report an assault. And when he asked what I'd do on my end, I told him I'd handle myself and hopefully it wouldn't come to that. And I grabbed his keys, keeping the car key separate, and told him I'd text updates every night and that he needed to keep his phone charged, stay put, and not contact anyone. And when he asked if that really meant 3 weeks, I told him it did and asked if he could handle it. And he nodded, saying he'd been wanting to disappear anyway, and this just made it official. And as I walked to the door, I stopped and told him one more thing, that if something happened to me, there was a folder on my laptop with everything needed to take this to the FBI, the password being our mom's birthday. And when he tried to cut me off, I told him nothing was going to happen, probably, but I liked contingencies. And then I opened the door to the morning light, thinking 3 weeks, and this would all be over. And as I walked to his silver Honda Civic, nothing special about it at all, I started the engine and drove toward his house, toward his wife who might be a victim or a conspirator, toward men who thought violence was a form of negotiation, knowing they had 3 weeks to collect $50,000 and I had 3 weeks to put them in prison, and the clock was already running, while they had no idea I even existed. And at 7:52 a.m., Wednesday, day 1, I pulled into the driveway of a nice neighborhood with trimmed lawns and American flags, the kind of place where people smiled and pretended everything was fine. And I sat in the car for 30 seconds getting into character, scared husband, desperate, beaten down, then walked to the front door, used his key, and found Emily in the kitchen holding a cup of coffee with red, puffy eyes like she'd been crying. And she jumped when she saw me and said she didn't think I'd come back. And I told her there wasn't anywhere else for me to go. And she set the coffee down without meeting my eyes and said Kyle had called that morning asking about my plan. And I told her my plan was to somehow find $50,000 in 3 weeks and asked if she had any ideas. And she said she was working on it while nodding and still refusing to look at me. And I walked past her knowing I needed to set up surveillance, but stopping long enough to ask her why Kyle had a key to the house. And for just a split second, her expression changed before the mask came back, and she said she gave it to him for emergencies a few months ago. And when I said she never told me, she said she didn't think it mattered, which I quietly filed away. And then I went upstairs to Mike's office, a small room with a desk, computer, and a bookshelf against the wall that was perfect for what I needed. So I pulled out my phone, opened the voice recorder, slid it behind the books for a clear angle, sat down at the computer, logged in with the password he gave me, and started searching. And at 10:14 a.m., I made my first real discovery when I found an email folder labeled Morrison Family, something I hadn't asked him about, and he probably forgot existed. And inside were 37 emails spanning 2 years, with the earliest ones looking completely normal. At first, the emails were harmless stuff like dinner invites, holiday planning, and pictures from some family barbecue. But about 6 months back, the tone shifted hard when an email came in from Ron that said, "Mike, we need to talk about your financial obligations to the family. Please call me as soon as you can." And Mike had replied asking what obligations he was talking about because the wedding help was a gift. And Ron wrote back saying there was a misunderstanding and that they had documentation proving otherwise and that they should meet in person. And after that, there was no reply from Mike. But then the messages from Kyle started coming in, short and sharp and angry, saying things like, "You're ignoring Ron's calls, and that's disrespectful. We tried to handle this the nice way. You're making it difficult. Last warning, call Ron today." And then there was silence for 3 months until 2 months ago when the loan documents suddenly appeared. So I took screenshots of every single email, and at 12:33 p.m. the doorbell rang, and when I went downstairs and opened the door, Kyle was standing there, bigger than I expected, filling the whole doorway, with the kind of face that looked like it enjoyed watching fear settle in. And he said, "Good, you're home." And I told him where else would I be, and he pushed past me into the living room without waiting for an invitation and said Ron wanted an update and asked how things were coming along. And I told him I was making calls and trying to liquidate some investments. And when he asked how much I could get, I said maybe 20,000 if I was lucky. And his jaw tightened as he said 20,000 isn't 50,000. And I told him I knew and that I was working on the rest. And he told me to work faster while he walked around the living room picking things up, looking at photos, inspecting the furniture like he was sizing up the house. And he said it was a nice place and it'd be a shame if something happened to it. And I didn't respond. And he set down a photo from Mike and Emily's wedding and said I had until the end of the month and that it wasn't negotiable. And when I asked what happens if I can't get it all by then, he stepped closer, close enough that I could smell his cologne. Expensive and completely wrong for a man who claimed to be broke. And he said, "Then we have a different conversation," and walked out. And I went upstairs and checked the recording, and the audio was crystal clear, but that cologne stuck with me because Kyle filed for bankruptcy 2 months ago and supposedly lost everything. So why did he smell like he'd just walked out of a high-end department store? And at 3:47 p.m. Emily came home carrying 3 shopping bags with designer logos I recognized. And when I asked where she'd been, she said out with friends. And when I asked which friends, she snapped back asking if it mattered and took the bags upstairs, closing the bedroom door. And when I looked down and saw the receipt she'd left on the counter, it was for $847.32 at Nordstrom, in a house that supposedly couldn't scrape together 50 grand. And by day 3, Friday, I spent all of Thursday digging through records, researching Morrison Construction, Kyle's bankruptcy filing, and Ron's business interests. And I found something interesting, because Ron Morrison had multiple LLCs, real estate holdings, and a property management company. And buried deep in public records, there was a lawsuit from 4 years ago that had been dismissed, filed by a couple named Michael and Jennifer Harding, alleging fraud, forgery, and extortion, and the case was dropped for insufficient evidence, or more accurately, because the Hardings withdrew it. So I wrote their names down, and Friday at 11:23 a.m. I called in sick to Mike's job and drove 40 minutes to a suburb I'd never been to, found the address from the court file, and knocked on the door of a house that looked a lot like Mike's, upper middle class with 2 cars in the driveway. And a woman in her mid-40s answered with cautious eyes. And when I asked if she was Jennifer Harding, she asked who was asking. And I told her my name didn't matter, that what mattered was that Ron Morrison was doing to my family exactly what he'd done to hers 4 years earlier. And her face drained of color as she said she didn't know what I was talking about. And I told her about forged loan documents, threats, violence, and demands for money that was never owed. And she looked past me at the street like she was checking for witnesses and told me I should leave. But I asked her to please tell me what happened and how Ron got the case dismissed. And she said he didn't get it dismissed. They dropped it. And when I asked why, she went quiet for a long time before saying it was because he threatened their daughter, saying accidents happen and teenagers make bad choices. And my stomach turned as she explained they had good evidence, but also had a 16-year-old daughter. And Ron made it clear that if they kept pushing, she'd pay for it. So they walked away, moved, changed their names, and started over. and she told me they'd spent 4 years looking over their shoulders. And when I said I was sorry, she told me not to be sorry, but to be smart, because whatever evidence I thought I had wouldn't matter since Ron had judges, lawyers, and cops in his pocket and was untouchable. And I told her maybe he was, but I wasn't her husband. And when she really looked at me and asked who I was, I told her I was someone who wasn't going to run, and I gave her my number and asked her to call if she changed her mind about testifying. And she didn't agree, but she didn't shut the door on it either. And by day 5, Sunday, Ron came to the house. And Emily made him coffee like he was a welcome guest instead of the man orchestrating her husband's extortion. And he asked how things were progressing, and I told him slowly, which he said wasn't encouraging. And when I told him I was trying, and that these things take time, he smiled this cold, practiced smile, and said time was the one thing I didn't have. And when I asked what he wanted me to do, rob a bank, he said he wanted me to be resourceful and suggested my brother or my parents or anyone else who might help. And when I said I wasn't dragging my family into this, he told me they were already involved by association. And he sipped his coffee and commented on the beautiful house and good neighborhood, and said it'd be a shame if the neighbors started hearing rumors about financial trouble or fraud. And when I called that a threat, he said it was just reality and that paying what I owed would make life go back to normal, but not paying would make things complicated. And after he left, Emily went upstairs and disappeared. And I checked my recordings, and every word was there. But I knew I needed more than threats and intimidation. I needed proof of the forgery itself. And on day 7, Tuesday, I tracked down the notary because every loan document had the same stamp, Patricia Vance, with a clear license number. And when I looked her up, I found she was licensed in 2018 and her listed address was 1847 Industrial Way, Suite 12, the exact same address as Morrison Construction LLC, meaning she worked for them. So I drove straight to the county records office and requested copies of her notary journal. Every notary is legally required to keep a detailed log of every document they notarize, including names, dates, and how IDs were verified. So when the clerk handed me the journal pages for the dates listed on the loan documents, I went straight to those entries and found nothing at all. No names, no signatures, no record of any notarization, which meant either Patricia Vance somehow forgot to log 3 separate transactions, or those documents were never signed in her presence to begin with. And that made it clear they were forged, no ambiguity left. So I made copies of everything and added them to the evidence folder. And by day 8, Wednesday, Emily's behavior was getting harder to ignore because she kept disappearing for hours at a time, coming back with more shopping bags, and spending long phone calls behind closed doors. So I decided to follow her. And she drove to a coffee shop where she met a man who was clearly not Kyle or Ron, younger, well-dressed, and comfortable with her. And they sat there talking for nearly an hour, during which he touched her hand twice, and she laughed like she hadn't laughed around me once since I arrived. And when they left, they hugged, longer than friends would. So I took photos, not for the FBI, but for my brother, because it was obvious now that his wife wasn't just complicit in the extortion, she was already gone from the marriage. And by day 10, Friday, Kyle showed up without warning asking for a progress update, and I told him I'd secured a loan for $30,000. Which made his eyes narrow as he pointed out it was still short of 50. And I told him I was working on the rest and that my brother was helping. And the moment I said that, his expression changed into something I couldn't quite read as he asked about my brother, saying he'd never met him and wondering where he lived. And when he asked if he looked like me, my heart stalled for half a second. But I kept my face calm and said we're brothers, so there's a resemblance. And Kyle stared at me for a long 5. Then 10 seconds before saying it was funny because Emily told him we were identical twins, even though she'd never met him either. And when he said we must be getting closer now that my brother was helping with the money, I didn't answer, and he smiled and said he was just making conversation before leaving. And the second he was gone, I texted my brother to stay hidden and not leave the apartment for any reason because Kyle was asking questions about us being twins. And when Mike replied asking what Kyle knew, I told him I wasn't sure, but that he was suspicious. And staring at my phone, I realized the situation had just gotten a lot more dangerous with 11 days still left on the clock. And on day 12, Sunday, Jennifer Harding finally called me, saying she'd been thinking about what I told her. So I stepped outside to talk where Emily couldn't overhear anything. And when I asked what she'd decided, she told me there were others, families before them and families after. And that Ron had been running this scheme for years. And when I asked how many, she said at least 4 families she knew of, possibly more. And when I asked for names, she said she'd text them, but warned me to be careful, because one man tried to fight back for real, and his business burned down a month later, ruled an accident. And as I wrote everything down, I realized this wasn't just fraud anymore. It was organized crime, years of extortion backed by threats and arson. And by day 13, Monday, I called Marcus, an old college friend who now worked FBI fraud. Someone I hadn't spoken to in 3 years, but who still picked up. And when he said this better be good because he was buried in paperwork, I told him about Ron Morrison, Morrison Construction, 6 years of extortion, forged documents, witness intimidation, and possible arson. And the line went silent until he asked how I knew all this. And I told him because I'd been living undercover in the latest victim's house for 2 weeks, recording everything, which made him stop me cold and demand an explanation. So I told him about the twin switch, the recordings, and the evidence I'd gathered. And after a long pause, he warned me that what I was doing was incredibly dangerous and possibly illegal, depending on consent laws. And when I told him it was a one-party consent state, he sighed and said, of course I checked, then told me to send everything I had so he could review it that night. And when I asked how fast he could move, he said if the evidence was as solid as I claimed, he could have a team ready in a week. And when I told him the deadline was 8 days out, he told me to pray my evidence was bulletproof. So I sent everything, recordings, screenshots, notary logs, and the Harding contact info, and waited. And on day 14, Tuesday, Marcus called back and told me they were in, explaining that Ron Morrison had been on their radar for 2 years, but they could never make anything stick until now, and that the recordings alone gave them probable cause, especially paired with the notary fraud and past victims. And when I asked what the plan was, he said they'd wait until the deadline and let them make their move, catching them in the act of extortion. And when I realized I was the bait and said so, he told me catching them mid-demand would make the case airtight. And I thought about Kyle's size, his temper, and what he might bring on deadline day, and asked what happens if they escalate. And Marcus assured me agents would be in position, and the moment it went sideways, they'd breach. And when I asked what if it went sideways before that, he said they'd give me a small wireless panic button, and that once pressed, they'd be through the door in 30 seconds, which I knew was a long time in the wrong situation, but still the best option I had. So I agreed, and by day 16, Thursday, Emily found the photos because I'd stupidly hidden them in Mike's desk drawer, and she stormed downstairs shaking and red-faced, demanding to know what the hell they were, and I calmly told her they were evidence, which made her ask evidence of what before accusing me of following her. And when I told her she'd been cheating on her husband, she snapped that it was none of my business, and I told her it became my business when her family started extorting him, which made her freeze as she asked what I'd just said, and I laid it all out, the forged loan documents, the threats, the violence, and the fact that she stood by while her husband's life was being destroyed. And when she said she didn't know about the forgeries, I told her she knew about the demands. She knew Kyle beat him, and she knew about the deadline. And when she said nothing, I told her she could have warned him months ago, but didn't because she was already planning her exit. And when she said I didn't know anything about her marriage, I told her I knew her husband trusted her, believed she loved him, and that he'd been hiding in an apartment for 2 weeks while I lived his life because his wife's family was trying to ruin him. Her expression shifted fast, anger draining away and confusion taking its place as she asked what I meant about hiding in an apartment, and the silence that followed told me I'd already said too much, because she slowly said that Mike had been here the whole time, every day and every night. And when I agreed but reminded her she'd just heard me say he was hiding, I knew I should have denied it or covered better, but I was exhausted from pretending, so I told her the truth, that I wasn't Mike, and she stared at me like I'd lost my mind until I explained I was his identical twin brother, that I'd been living here for 2 weeks collecting evidence against her family, and the color drained from her face as she whispered that it wasn't possible. So I laid it out for her, that we're identical in height, voice, and face, and she never noticed because she stopped really seeing her husband months ago, and she sank into a chair like her legs had given out, realizing that this whole time Mike had been safe, away from Kyle and Ron, while I documented everything. And when she asked why, I told her because someone had to protect him, and she sure wasn't going to. And when she started crying, I felt nothing at all, and by day 18, Saturday, 2 days before the deadline, Emily hadn't said a word to me since the truth came out, locking herself in the bedroom, and calling Kyle twice that I heard through the door, but couldn't make out. And it didn't matter anyway because the FBI already knew and were ready, and whatever she told her family wouldn't stop what was coming. So I texted Mike that it was 2 days out and to stay ready, and he replied that he'd been ready for 3 weeks, and on day 19, Sunday, Ron showed up alone for the first time, which immediately set my nerves off, and he sat in the living room with that same calm posture and cold eyes, while Emily tried calling me, and I ignored it. And Ron told me she'd said something interesting, that I wasn't who I claimed to be, and when I said she was confused from stress, he corrected me and said she was observant, more than we'd given her credit for, then stood and walked toward me, laying out his theory piece by piece, that Mike had a twin brother, that the twin had been living here for weeks recording conversations and playing hero, and he stopped 3 feet away and asked if he was wrong, and there was no point lying anymore, so I told him he wasn't, and he smiled thin and reptilian and thanked me for being honest before pulling out his phone and showing me a photo of my brother standing at the window of my apartment, telling me they'd found him 2 days ago, and that Kyle had been watching him because he's predictable, same coffee shop every morning and same afternoon walks, and my blood turned cold as Ron said Mike was fine for now, but then laid out a new arrangement, that tomorrow on the deadline I bring $50,000 in cash, and we both walk away with no FBI or recordings, and if I didn't, Kyle would visit my brother, who unlike me wouldn't have an FBI panic button, and the moment I realized he knew about the panic button my stomach dropped, and when I asked how he knew, Ron told me to think carefully and said I had until tomorrow night before leaving, and I immediately called Marcus and told him we had a serious problem, explaining the threat, the photo, and the leak, and after a long pause Marcus told me there was no leak on their end, but that they were accelerating the timeline, that tomorrow when they came for the money they'd move, and that they were extracting my brother that night, and when I asked how he told me to leave it to them and just be ready. So I hung up and sat alone in the living room knowing that by tomorrow everything would end one way or another, and on day 20, Monday, deadline day, at 7:34 a.m. I got a text from Marcus saying my brother was secure and had been extracted at 3 a.m. to the field office, and the relief nearly knocked me over because no matter what happened next Mike was safe. And at 4:15 p.m. I got a text from an unknown number with a photo of Kyle's car parked 2 blocks away, meaning they were already watching, and at 6:47 p.m. Emily finally came downstairs for the first time in 3 days and told me they were coming that night, that Kyle had a bag with tools and was talking about making an example, and when I told her to let him try, she looked at me with something different in her eyes and admitted she didn't know about the forgeries at first, that by the time she understood she was scared because Kyle wasn't just violent with outsiders. And when I asked if he'd hurt her too, she said once, when she questioned the plan, and that Ron calmed him down. But she should have warned Mike and didn't because she was afraid. And when I told her fear didn't excuse what she allowed to happen, she said she knew and apologized. But sorry didn't undo 3 years of lies. And at 8:23 p.m. the front door opened and Kyle came in first with Ron right behind him, Kyle carrying a heavy duffel bag with metal shifting inside. And Ron said time was up and asked for the money. And when I told him there was no money, Kyle smiled and unzipped the bag to reveal a crowbar, a wrench, a hammer, and zip ties before saying we'd do it the hard way. And when he picked up the crowbar and demanded the money one last time, I told him again there was no money and never would be. And when he swung, I ducked and the crowbar smashed into the wall, drywall exploding. And then the front door burst open as FBI agents poured in shouting for everyone to freeze, guns drawn, and Kyle spun with the crowbar still in hand until they ordered him to drop it. And after a moment he did, and went to the ground with Ron right after him. And Agent Shin appeared beside me asking if I was okay, and saying they saw the swing and my reflexes were good. And as they cuffed Kyle and Ron and read them their rights and cataloged the contents of the bag, Ron looked up at me from the floor and asked who I was. And I crouched down so he could see my face clearly and told him I was the twin he never knew about, and that I'd recorded his entire criminal operation. And as his face went white, I listed it all: the notary fraud, the Hardings, the other families, the arson, every piece of it. And when he tried to interrupt, I told him the FBI had everything and that he and Kyle were finished for good, and they dragged him out as neighbors gathered on their porches filming while the Morrison family's reputation collapsed in real time. And Emily stood in the hallway asking what happens now, and I told her now she gets to decide. and it starts with testifying against her family. I told her the choice was simple: help the prosecution and maybe get immunity, or stay quiet and fall with her family. And when she said she didn't know about the arson, I told her then she'd better prove that by telling them everything she did know. And she went silent for a long moment, saying she needed time to think. So I told her to think fast because the FBI wouldn't wait forever. Then I stepped outside and took a deep breath of fresh air, realizing 3 straight weeks of living someone else's life, 3 weeks of acting scared and beaten down, were finally over. And the week after the arrest was pure chaos, with daily FBI interviews that lasted for hours as they walked me through the timeline. Every recording, every decision, asking how I knew about the Hardings and why I followed Emily and how I found the notary. And I answered everything honestly, laying out every discovery I'd made during those 3 weeks. While Mike sat through his own interviews explaining the beatings, the threats, and the fear he'd been living with. And by week 2, the full picture came together, showing 6 families extorted over 6 years for more than $400,000. And the notary, Patricia Vance, flipped immediately, admitting Frank paid her $5,000 per set of forged documents and that she'd been doing it for years while intentionally skipping her logs. And the arson was still being investigated, but a former Morrison Construction employee stepped forward, saying Kyle bragged about teaching someone a lesson right before the fire. And by week 3, the preliminary hearing began with Kyle and Ron in orange jumpsuits and shackles, denied bail, while the prosecutor laid out 17 federal charges including extortion, wire fraud, conspiracy, forgery, and witness intimidation. And when Ron's lawyer tried, arguing entrapment, and claimed I'd provoked them and manufactured evidence, the judge shut it down, pointing out that the defendant's own recorded words showed a clear pattern of criminal behavior over years, and the motion was denied. And Kyle fired his lawyer that same afternoon, demanding a new one in a classic delay move. And by month 2, Emily testified before the grand jury in a closed session I wasn't allowed into. So Mike and I waited outside together, the first time we'd sat in public since everything began. And when I asked what he thought she was saying, he said probably whatever kept her out of prison. And when I asked if he still loved her, he thought hard before saying he loved who he believed she was, not who she turned out to be. And when Emily came out 2 hours later, she wouldn't look at us and left with her lawyer. And we later learned she'd known about the extortion for 4 months, helped coordinate Kyle's visits, and knew about the forged documents, though she claimed she didn't know about the violence or the arson. And while the FBI didn't buy all of it, they believed enough to offer her immunity in exchange for testimony, meaning Emily Morrison would walk free, because justice is sometimes incomplete. And by month 4, Kyle cracked, offering full cooperation to reduce his sentence, agreeing to testify against Ron, admit to the forgeries, name the notary, and explain the entire operation in exchange for 8 years instead of 15. And Ron's reaction made the news when cameras caught him being led through the courthouse and seeing Kyle across the lobby and snapping, shouting traitor, and threatening him until guards restrained him, showing the jury pool and the judge exactly who he really was. And by month 6, the trial began with Ron Morrison facing 16 counts as the prosecution played every one of my recordings, 3 weeks of threats, admissions, and planning, including lines about fake documents and making things complicated, while the Hardings testified with pale faces and shaking voices along with 2 other families, describing the same pattern of fear and intimidation. And after 6 hours of deliberation, the jury returned guilty on all counts, sentencing Ron Morrison to 12 years in federal prison with no parole for 10, Kyle Morrison to 8 years with parole eligibility in 5, and ordering $217,000 in restitution split among the victims, with Mike receiving exactly $50,000, the same amount they tried to extort, which made him laugh and say they were paying him now. And by month 8, Mike signed the divorce papers without contest, while Emily didn't fight for anything and disappeared to another state with her immunity and her guilt. And when I asked Mike if he had regrets over beers at my apartment during our first relaxed night in months, he said not about the divorce, but about not seeing the signs sooner. And when I asked what was next, he said a fresh start in Seattle where nobody knew the Morrison name. And I understood, because sometimes distance is the only way to heal. And a year later, Kyle sent me a handwritten letter from prison apologizing and blaming the bankruptcy and Frank's influence, which I read once and then burned because desperation doesn't excuse torture, while Ron never wrote and spent his first year filing appeals that were all denied. meaning he'd be 70 if he ever got out. And that spring I flew to Seattle, where Mike picked me up looking lighter and younger somehow. And when I joked that the rain suited him, he said the lack of extortion suited him more, and we laughed for the first time about it all. And later, walking along the waterfront, he asked why I'd done it. Those 3 weeks of risk. And I told him that growing up, he was always the one getting hurt while I watched, unable to help. And this time I could actually do something and couldn't let it happen again. And we stood there as two brothers with the same face and different lives, finally finding their way back to each other, agreeing to meet again next year. Because what I learned is that predators rely on fear, silence, and isolation, and the Morrisons built a system around fake deaths and violence that worked for years because everyone was alone. But Mike wasn't alone. He had someone who shared his face and blood and was willing to step into the fire. And now Ron Morrison is serving 12 years. Kyle Morrison 8, Patricia Vance 2, Emily lives somewhere in Texas and isn't mentioned. Mike lives in Seattle starting over. And I'm the same man I was before, except now I know that family isn't DNA or obligation, but the person who opens the door at midnight when you're bleeding and says we're identical and means I'll become you if that's what it takes. And the Morrisons thought family meant control and leverage, but they were wrong. And that's why they're in prison and we're free.